It is a pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
El ICA le da la bienvenida a este evento y agradece su
participación. Welcome you to this event and thanks your participation. Those are some recommendations to improve the video conference. Unmute your microphone only when you are given the floor. We ask that you keep your camera on at all times. If you need to step away for a moment, you can turn the camera off and turn it back when you come back. Please mute your cell phones to avoid any interruptions during the video conference. We recommend that you maintain proper posture and position yourself adequately in front of your computer. Simultaneous interpretation will be provided for this meeting. It is very important that you speak in the language corresponding to the Zoom link you selected. For instance, if you access the link to the meeting in Spanish, you must speak in Spanish at all times. At the end of the video, please remain silent for 30 seconds. Afterwards, the moderator will begin the meeting. Thank you for your attention.
Excellent. Well, welcome everyone to our fifth and final webinar of the series on sustainable beef. It's a pleasure for us to welcome you. We're speaking from Ottawa. I'm the Canadian representative of ICA, and we are going to be talking about promoting development outcomes, value chain sustainability in this final set. You can view all the other 4 webinars on our ICA Canada page anytime. And so we've got an exciting panel today, and as for those of you familiar with our process, we have a little bit of a video from IFAD, our sponsor, from Costa Rica in headquarters. We have our Deputy Director General, Jose, provide some words of welcome, and a shout out to everyone watching on Facebook and YouTube. Here we're in Zoom, and we're monitoring your sessions. If you have any questions, post them there. We'll bring them into Zoom, and we'll see if anyone of the panelists will answer. So let's start with the 2 videos then. Gloria, Isabel, please.
On behalf of IFAD, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this seminar on sustainable livestock. This initiative, organised by the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture and financed by the International Fund for Agriculture Development, or IFAD, also has the technical support of the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef and the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. As you know, climate change will affect animal health, well-being and productivity, with resulting effects especially on pastoralists and small-scale livestock keepers. Changes in climate can lead to new animal pests or to the return of previously eradicated diseases. The secondary impacts of climate change on livestock may include, among others, increased pressure on productive pastures, water resources, and increased fodder prices, ultimately resulting in a loss of food sources, income, and livestock assets. Climate change impacts on poor and disadvantaged rural people disproportionately. Pastoralists, poor households, women, children, youth, and marginalised Indigenous groups being particularly vulnerable. In addition, poverty, lack of political power, and marginalisation from decision-making processes reduce the ability of these groups to adapt to climate change. Climate change is likely to intensify existing inequalities and have different effects on the capacity of women and men to cope with additional stress. In fact, women play a significant and active role in livestock production systems. Climate change necessitates rethinking approaches to gender inequality and to involve both women and men in finding innovative solutions. Between 2003 and 2015, IFAD invested almost $500 million to promote pastoral development. In addition, last year, IFAD launched the Adaptation for Smallholder Agriculture program, or ASSET+, which aims at increasing the resilience of vulnerable communities, farmers, fishers, and pastoralists. For example, in Sudan, livestock business development aims to promote access to finance for livestock owners and market development of the national livestock industry. In Lesotho, wool and mohair production is being improved on the ground with co-benefits for rangeland rehabilitation. In Kyrgyzstan, Asset Plus contributes to enhancing economic growth in pastoral communities through community-driven development approaches. Thank you in advance for your participation today. We look forward to the outcomes of today's discussion. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Lloyd Day, and I'm the Deputy Director General of the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture, ICA. ICA represents the Ministers of Agriculture of the Western Hemisphere, from Canada in the north to Chile and Argentina in the south, and 14 member states in the Caribbean as well. Our mission is to promote agricultural development and rural well-being in the Americas and the Caribbean, and to serve as a bridge for this region's contribution to agricultural production and science around the world. Welcome to this webinar series from ICA Canada on sustainable beef. As someone who once led the checkoff programs at the US Department of Agriculture, the saying, "Beef, it's what's for dinner," is embedded in my DNA. Working on behalf of agriculture in the Americas, I can tell you that I have not only enjoyed a good steak in Ottawa, our Canadian host city, but also in many other cities and countries in the Americas where the beef sector is not just an important part of each nation's economic activity, but is ingrained in the culture, society, and history of the people. However, the sector also faces many challenges with growing anxiety about climate change and certain methods of production, as well as animal welfare. We must address these concerns to improve not just our methods of production for the sake of the environment and animals, but also show how the sector is vital for its contributions to society. Therefore, we at ICA have been working closely with myriad organizations in the livestock sector to ensure a more balanced and scientific analysis of the importance of livestock. In preparation for the UN Food Systems Summit, ICA partnered with the livestock sector in multiple different fora and publications to provide guidance and leadership from the Americas on the contributions of livestock to the human health, nutrition, the economy, and the environment. This culminated with ICA's Director General, Dr. Manuel Otero, presenting 16 key messages from the Americas to the United Nations Food Systems Summit regarding agriculture's important role in the transformation of the world's food systems based on farmers, science, and agriculture as part of the solution to our planetary challenges. We are delighted to be joining in these webinars with the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, with whom ICA formed an alliance in 2022, and the Canadian Roundtable on Sustainable Beef, our Canadian partner. Thank you to the International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD, for their sponsorship of these webinars and the decades of collaboration with ICA in the Americas. We are very grateful also for the time and intellectual contribution by all of our speakers during these sessions. Your contributions to these discussions will become part of the intellectual record that will help us promote our goal to provide important contributions to the policies that nations generate to help support sustainable beef production in the Americas, the Caribbean, and other regions of the world. Thank you, and best wishes for a successful webinar.
Excellent. My thanks, Ron and Lloyd, for those opening remarks. I'm going to pass over to set the stage. We're going to invite Dr. Walter Bitkin from the Columbia Climate School and Earth Institute to help us better understand the topic today. Over to you, Walter.
Muy bien, voy a hablar en español.
Good morning. I'm going to speak in Spanish and I'm going to show my slides in English. First of all, thank you for the invitation. I will share my screen and please let me know if you can see my screen. This is the title of the presentation: Sustainable Livestock Production in the Americas. have short time, so I want to show you these two things together. This one is related to healthy and sustainable diets, another one related to climate change. The third point is returning to equilibrium, and for which is the carbon footprint and other impacts. So we begin with the healthy and sustainable diets. First of all, there are ethical considerations, and with regard to this, an increase, an overconsumption, an increase in demand for livestock is affecting the environment. The fact that some third part of the cereal produced in the world is fed to animals while the world faces seasonal hunger and famines. The access to costly foods, as many animal food, is not a fair situation. However, it is critically important for human health because it provides micronutrients that are vital. And finally, a diet published by the Eat Lancet Commission that recommends a flexitarian diet with lower consumption in animal origin food has received a lot of criticisms on whether this diet is locally adaptable and not, and if it is culturally, socially, and geographically adaptable. And the other thing important related to health is what are the risks associated to the different diets. There's a pretty good job carried out for 3 years all over the world, and the results were published recently, and that shows that now mankind most risks of death are associated to diet. This is new. So the first question we ask is, what are the diets that affect those risks the most? And those are the results for the whole world. They are very similar for the region considered in the study. And the point is that there are 5 types of diet that are more associated to risk mortality. It includes high sodium, uh, low fruit, low seeds and nuts, low legumes. And on the other hand, those with less risk include things such as diet with animal products, animal origin products. This is a little bit to show the change of some of them, and some of them are repeated all over the world. The second point I want to mention is climate change. Climate change, as we know, the key factor here is the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. In the case of the livestock production, it is always associated to methane emissions. In the global scenario, what are the sources of these greenhouse gas emissions? In a very simplified manner, if we divide this by sector and activity, basically more than 70% of greenhouse gas emissions comes from energy. Some 12% come from agriculture, and half, more or less half of it are associated to the livestock. So we need to keep this in mind when we talk about the impacts of different things on climate change. We need to think about the relative magnitude we're talking about. More than 30% comes from energy, 12% from agriculture. In relation to climate change and the greenhouse gases and livestock production, there are 3 gases that matter, which are carbon dioxide. By definition, it has this global warming power equal to 1, and it stays for more than 1,000 years in the atmosphere. Today, we are still suffering of the consequences of carbon dioxide emissions from nuclear situations. In second place, methane, which absorbs more heat than CO2. It has a GWP potential of 28, stays less time in the atmosphere, 10 to 15 years. And finally, the nitrous oxide that absorbs much more heat, 200 and something more than carbon dioxide, and it stays in the atmosphere for some 100 years. Let's focus on the first two, which are particularly important in the livestock production. What may happen with the emissions of these gases? Three things may happen: that emissions increase with time, that emissions remain constant, or that emissions fall down. What happens in each one of these scenarios with global temperature? If gases increase, carbon dioxide increases, the effect in temperature is exponential. So what increases as the emissions increase, everything from previous years accumulates. So 1,000 years. The methane effect is like the increase effect. So the more the increase, the more the emissions, the higher the temperature. When gases remain constant, carbon dioxide continues heating the temperature in the planet. The methane effect does not stop. Why? Because whenever there are new methane issuance, the time continues. What happens when emissions are reduced? Even by reducing the emissions, the effect of carbon dioxide continues heating the surface. Why? We have all this 1,000 years cumulative effect. So if the methane emissions are reduced, the effect of reducing temperatures in the planet is immediate. So if methane emissions go down and the temperature of the world gets colder. So this is the recent recommendation. An intelligent measure is to reduce the methane emissions. Very often this is associated to livestock production in the world. Let me go back to this outline. In the sector, the fossil fuel sector, we have emissions, fugitive emissions. The value is very similar to the livestock production. What happens whenever a carbon mine, a coal mine is venting, it gives methane to the atmosphere. There are fugitive emissions in oil wells, in natural gas, fugitive emissions, losses in natural gas transport, fugitive emissions in fracking. And the estimation is that if fossil fuel companies were capable to capture some of these fugitive emissions, 30% of losses can be avoided at a negative cost. So they capture these emissions, they sell this as natural gas, and they have a benefit. So it is evident that the immediate opportunity, the most simple one and the smartest one, is to reduce methane emissions from the sector of fossil fuels. If we can reduce emissions in the animal production sector and the waste management, much better. The third concept is to return to the equilibrium, a question that we do not ask enough. What was the situation before domestic livestock production? And there is an important job published in the National Cardio Science that studied the impact of three big animal losses. Basically, they studied methane emissions from enteric fermentation from herbivores 12,000 years ago, and then how these are affected by three important phenomena. Disease, a complicated disease in the world, and then the death of vessels in North America. So 12,000 years back, 1 billion of large animals in terrestrial ecosystems extinguished. Just in the Americas, we lost 150 species of large animals. The average weight of animals in South America was almost 1 ton. I'm referring to large animals. So the interesting question is how were the emissions of methane coming from herbivores before the disappearance of this billion of large animals? This is what the researchers discovered. In the methane emissions coming from all of them were wild animals 12,000 years ago, were quite similar to the methane emissions of the domestic livestock nowadays. So when we think, when we plan to go back to an equilibrium, to the natural state, what is the natural state we need to go back to? What can we compare? If we think about the natural ecosystems as the big prairies in North America, or the big prairies and natural prairies in southeast of South America, those are the systems that for millions of years have evolved with herbivores. So I believe this is an interesting topic to consider. When we talked about the sustainable livestock production system, which systems are we talking about? We're talking about a system that finds tropical forest, cut it, burns it, and produces meat. We're talking about industrial production systems with thousands of animals confined, or are we talking about animal production in natural ecosystems that millions of years ago were herbivores? So talking about sustainable systems is like talking about the emissions of cars. Which car are we talking about? Are we talking about the vehicle that gives 5 kilometers per liter, a hybrid that gives 33 kilometers per liter, or an electric one without emissions? What is vital when we think on sustainable systems of cattle livestock production is to differentiate the systems. Those who are not on the topic tend to talk about livestock production. There's no livestock production as there's no one single vehicle. There are thousands. And point number 4 that I want to mention with you is we talked about the carbon footprint. Let's think in other impacts associated. For example, if we have the livestock in natural grasslands, in natural ecosystems, there may be high methane emissions. Maybe if we improve the efficiency, if we improve the pasture management, if we use additives, we can even reduce the carbon footprint. But also, in these production systems based on pastures, we have the conservation of a natural ecosystem, which is one of the natural pastures that are threatening the world, keeping the biodiversity. We have a food safety. There's no antibiotics, no hormones. In many cases, the case I know in Uruguay, 100% of livestock with traceability. What are the alternatives to these production systems? The industrial production. What happens with animal welfare? What happens with other ecosystem services? For example, water quality, carbon sequestration capacity. I believe that when we think about sustainable systems and the footprints of the livestock systems, more than focusing just on carbon, we need to think on an integrated environmental footprint, considering these dimensions. And because of the preference and world consumers, probably that will end on an environmental value added of this product that respects all these dimensions. Those are the 4 big things I want to comment with you. I really thank you once again for the invitation, and I remain available in case there are questions. Thank you, Dr. Beckham. I really love the last slide. It made me think on health on the side of the agricultural health. For those of you who do not know and would like to learn more about methane, we have in the first presentation of this webinar, we talked to a professor of the UC Davis. He spoke in detail about methane. So I invite you to listen to that webinar. Walter, could you add some links in the chat to publications that may be useful for the audience? I really thank you for that.
I would like to invite any of the panelists as well to chat with Walter, ask him any questions. I'd like to move on from his presentation. He really did a good job setting the stage. Now we have different presentations. We're going to have a perspective from Mexico, from Colombia, from Spain and Canada. And we're going to start with a beef view, a bovine view from Mexico with Everardo Gonzalez. Over to you, sir.
Muchas gracias. Si me permite.
Thank you very much. If you allow me, I want to thank you for this invitation. I'm going to share the screen.
Muy bien.
No, this is not the one. I'm sorry. This is the presentation. Well, first of all, we need to identify what the importance of livestock. We know that it's essential for the global nutrition. It is part of the agricultural economy, and as my previous presenter, it is important of the micronutrients of critical micronutrients, mainly for childhood. So besides providing feed, it also provides many other things, and it is essential for the stability of the different ecosystems. Of course, from the social point of view, there is an important source of income, mostly for the people that have less income. So also they are making a good use of the natural resources and the agro-industrial resources that probably it would not have a lot of opportunity to use this in different cases. It also has an economic aspect. About 60% of the rural countries in developing countries, more than 1,000 million of poor people, at least they receive part of their income from this sector. And in Latin America, this is a huge population. It also generates about 1,700 millions of work employment. 70% are women, and this will allow an improvement of the nutrition of their kids and their families, and it also helps the development of women in many societies of the world. It also has cultural and spiritual connotations that would be very difficult to change this. It's the activity, the widest spread activity in the planet. It occupies about 3,550 millions of hectares, and it uses about the 33% of the agricultural lands. In total, the process of this sector, it's more of 3,700 millions of dry matter, millions of tons, I'm sorry, of dry matter. So given the dimension of the territories that it occupies and what involves about the humanity, it has some problems, but also has a very positive outcome. So in 2019, there were more than 1,300 million of tons of meat and milk. Also, it has contributed to the expansion of the demographic an annual rate of the demographic growth. And in case of Latin America, it's particularly important. Mostly Brazil, they provide 44% of the world export of beef and 40% of chicken, and also Mexico and Argentina and Uruguay are also present, and mostly in chicken. Then Brazil, it's contributes a little bit less in this sector. It is an activity that it's present, being an activity that is not only economic, but has other things. And the concept of sustainability, it is a concept that it's new. These started in the concepts that have been discussed in the Club de Roma in the 1960s, and that's why this book was created, talking about growth, and that's when they started using for the first time the term sustainability to try to have more equilibrium in protecting the natural resources. Then further on in 1987, the United Nations presents the Brundtland report, where the concept of sustainable development started and starts to grow, incorporating some social and economic aspects and the interconnections between them, because this is a topic that should not be looked at from just one angle. So the sustainable development is what satisfies the current needs of the people without putting in jeopardy the future generations. So basically, it is a term of concepts that are relatively new. So the impact of this activity, it's huge, the negative impact. We're estimating that the emissions, we're talking about 7.1 gigatons, of carbon dioxide per year, which represents about 14.5% of what it has been known as anthropogenic emissions. But those of us that are in this livestock sector, so we always say that there is not one molecule of methane that has not been fixed previously atmospherically. So it's not the same to consider anthropogenic something that the man took from deep the earth and they oxidate this and launches this to the atmosphere. We cannot consider that a biological effort. So, but nevertheless, we cannot ignore this amount, this large contribution to the CO2. But it's not only that; it's just a degradation of the soil. At least the images that we were looking at the previous presentation, how the animal population has grown. Of course, these contribute with, especially when you have very intensive production. And of course, that this produces a loss of biodiversity, and this at the same time affects the climate change. Of course, the livestock represents the largest sector. It's mostly meat and milk. More than 65% of the greenhouses emissions comes from livestock. And then regarding chicken and pork in different proportions. We're talking about this mostly punctual contamination and waste management. And we also know that the intensification of the emissions are directly related to the management that we can offer to livestock. We know that when we improve the way that we feed the livestock, managing the grasslands and all these things, this is a very important topic from the technical point of view within livestock. In Mexico, livestock in Mexico occupies more than 50%, actually occupies 58% of the national territory. And most of these are, there are 3.5 millions being exploded, but the great consortia are just a few, as I will show you further on. It represents 34% of the GDP, and it generates about 1 million of gives 1 million of work positions. It shows a growth, a sustained growth. The production of meat has been very dynamic, with a growth rate of 2.7% yearly. And this is due mostly to try to keep a good health standard that can allow us to access almost all world market. The production of beef is very important. It represents 28% of the whole meat production of the country, and Mexico is the sixth world producer of meat and the fifth in the consumption of meat per capita. So we consider for these calculations the European Union as if the European Union would be a country. Now, regarding the gas emission represents the 3.2% emissions of the country. But if we compare this to other things, we know that the large emission comes from cattle. In this case, here we have on the right, you can see these variables, because the rest, the emissions that they produce are relatively low. And then in the last report from Mexico, it is referred to 2019. It was made in 2021. And they estimate that livestock produce 109.8 million of tons of greenhouse emission. And in the last 30 years, the emissions of the greenhouse emissions has been growing beneath the growth rate of the population and the growth rate of the production. It means that our carbon footprint has been decreasing slowly. And then on the other side, the production of CO2 in the land was more than 200 tons. That's more than what the sector represents. And I must highlight this, that more of half of the national population is being occupied by livestock activities. This is the history and how this has been calculated. We must admit that we have continued to calculate this in very wide figures, and we have the responsibility to improve this, and we have to refine these kind of calculation in our data. Now, what we have to do is for sure to increase the productivity, because when we have larger productivity, the emission decrease. So the sustainable intensification is a way, because then the emissions are distributed in the final product. And also we have a few number of animals that only participate with some of the emissions. And the other thing that we have to increase is the ability of carbon sequestration in the soil and through biomass, which is a great opportunity that has received not a lot of attention in comparison to the potential that it has in terms of mitigation, and also in terms of technical assistance to producers and to an objective evaluation of these features. These obvious, of course, it's easier said than done when you have more than 1 million independent producers of meat, and 75% of them has less than 20 cows, and they have about 25% of the cattle. And then on the other hand, you have a group of producers, they own mostly like 30% of the cattle, but that I insist they represent only less than 3% of the production producers of the country. And this information can be reached easily. And it's very hard to use these things. Therefore, we need to get hold of more modern techniques to calculate this, and also the system of production of cattle. Mexico has a capacity of 7,000 livestock, 7,000 cattle. And we must understand that we have about 635 heads, and 84 have the ability of managing more than 50 heads of cattle. And these are people that are business people that do not need additional support in terms of technical support. It is actually the other million of producers that we were talking about, the ones that are creating greater emission, because they're the ones that are raising the cattle where we have to focus. We have from advantages, a growing market of livestock, of beef, and it is important to gather the information that we have, which normally it's around a lot of different organizations, and then bring this information together, have a better diagnostic. And we know that there are a lot of ways that we have to mitigate this, and we can capture this carbon and that it's involved in this system. Also, the experience of integration and the potential of development, that is also an advantage. We have to make a huge effort, in my opinion, that try to bring some truth into information that it's maybe not necessarily true, or that has like a strong tendency. We have to acknowledge the contribution, but we have to also pay attention to that. There are also information about the ecosystems and advancements in terms of nutrition. It means that if we are able to create a positive perception, it means that people will be more willing to work together to mitigate the condition of emissions. And well, thank you very much. Thank you very much. There are many challenges from Mexico, mostly the million of small producers, but there is a lot of potential. If you could share in this chat some links to your publications or a database. We are going to travel from Mexico to Colombia, and we're going to invite Clarita so that we can have a perspective from the South.
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. Good afternoon, everybody. We thank you for the invitation. We are very pleased to share the experience and dynamics that has taken place in the sustainable livestock group in Colombia. Let me talk about these 4 milestones that we consider important for Colombia's group. As we will see later, the process has included broadly included the participation of many sectors. In 2014, since the Global Age Agenda, we created the group in Colombia. Between 2016 and 2018, 2 important things occur. We developed the Colombian Sustainable Livestock Project, and we have some sustainable livestock forums, and that consolidates an important basis for knowledge management. in the country. In 2020, we held a workshop of users and sources supported by FAO and many sectors in the country, and we developed the action plan that we'll mention later. And in 21-22, we work on the consolidation of principles criteria, which is an adaptation of the principles of the global group. And finally, we have the sustainable livestock policy in Colombia. The essence of the group, and there are important points. One led by the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development, and this is a public and there is a public and private partnership with a multi-scale approximation, and we consider the global scale, national, regional, and landscape scale. We consider this in analysis and evidence consideration about sustainable livestock. This group promotes the dialogue about cooperation, collaboration, and the ways to share and transmit knowledge about sustainable livestock. So in essence, it is aimed to the sustainability management in livestock landscape based on policy guidelines from the global group as well as the national reference framework. Nowadays, we have 70 organizations of diverse nature in the national group, 72% of private sector and 28% from public sector. And the participation has increased importantly. The participation takes place from universities, international NGOs, ministers of agriculture, environment, and communication and information technologies, the banking sector, research institutes, both private and public, and companies like the Success Group or Éxito Group and institutes of training. In the organization, the national group, we have a technical secretariat and 3 commissions. One, the Commission of Policy and Institutionality led by the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development, a Commission of Knowledge Management led by the Institute of Integra, and a Market Commission led by Solidarity. Besides this national structure, we have 15 regional groups, and each group has 1 technical secretariat and 1 manager. So we have these 15 regional groups. Important to highlight that the groups are not only representing committees or groups from the cattle sector, but they also represent the different ecosystems that exist in Colombia, which is a diverse country. So we have the dry Caribbean, the humid Caribbean, the Amazonia, Interandean valleys, and multiple ecosystems. So starting from this exercise, we developed the action plan with 4 main points. One, the national policy, resolution of 2022. So we have this resolution 00126 from 22 of sustainable livestock for the country. Number 2, and this plan 2022, the national group was to define the principles, criteria, and indicators of sustainable and landscape, sustainable and livestock and landscape. And it includes the regional interpretation guidance. And the third important point is the pilot exercises for implementation of the framework. 2 have been held in 3 different landscapes. And finally, the Observatory of Sustainable Livestock landscape. Interesting what Dr. Gonzalez mentioned on how to put together the accurate information as well as the indications that show the trend and sustainability of this landscape. Point number 4, we are still working on. The 3 other ones are concluded, and they are finalized for implementation. Regarding Resolution 126, it includes the principles, criteria, and indicators selected in the group, and it has 3 different structures. The first one talks about sustainability of the market. It includes environmental issues, market issues, and agricultural reproduction. The group 2 that talks about governance and institutionality, it has standards and funding, which includes all this funding issue for sustainable livestock in any area, particularly in the technological part, technology consolidation of structures of traceability, for example. What is the importance of having a national reference framework? There were multiple initiatives in the country. So private companies or the ministries or the NGOs or institutions had different ways to go, difficult to compare regarding evaluation and implementation. Now we have our common reference for everything, and the idea is to establish how the stakeholders should analyze the condition and trend of sustainability. It is important that this framework makes available a set of multidimensional requirements guiding management systems in livestock landscapes. It also make it possible to plan and implement viable scenarios of sustainability. So all these strategies that are proposed of transformation and transition of landscapes will have control, simulation, and environments. It is also important that the results make possible the ongoing and effective improvement, and we are seeing a trend towards sustainability. It is also important that in this framework for the design and implementation, we have the participation of the livestock sector, institutions, companies, and other stakeholders that are not necessarily from the livestock sector. This framework has some focus. Mainly, we have five: a concerted definition, and that's why I refer the important thing of the milestone. This process in Colombia has taken place on a participatory manner. The definition of sustainable livestock in Colombia is established on a concerted manner. It has an analysis unit called the livestock landscape that lets to see from the national aspect till the punctual aspects, from even from the comparative units. It has a structure of criteria and indicators cross-cutting to this collective intelligence. There is also an approach on how to articulate these principles, the principles that are on the national reference framework. As you see on the screen, one principle may give an answer to multiple SDGs, and they are not by specific topics, but on an integrated manner, it can answer several SDGs. So the sustainability, the management phases for sustainability are these five. The phases as a preparation phase, analytical phase, with the evidence that you mentioned that are important to really know what is happening in terms of sustainability on a measured manner. A third one, which is strategic planning. Fourth one of operational transition, and a reporting phase, the fifth phase. So in this, I can be on a phase and requiring to go back to another one to establish parts of the process. The national reference framework I am mentioning corresponds to the first phase of preparation, and the pilots uh, correspond to the analytical phase. It is important to know that we have the national reference framework and the regional interpretation guidance, but this is not the end. So we need to go on through the four phases. The landscape, the livestock landscape must have the possibility to determine as a limit, but this structure is a functional structure. It means I should be able to see what I want to see using the indicators in, and the challenges we established are specific for the landscape where the activity is taking place, as well as to the social and ecological relationships. I have mentioned in this in previous interventions. The livestock is different because it takes place in different landscapes. So the livestock is different in the different places we have in the country. In the Amazonia, there are differences. It is not just one single livestock. These units, which are analysis units, led us to understand on a systemic manner the natural urban issues. But something very important we are emphasizing are the synergies that occur between the livestock plots. With the collective intelligence, we are proposing the creation of a culture where the stakeholders landscape through collaborative networks, understanding that through collaboration and participation, we may perceive a common identity. And this is related to the landscape and territories based on confidence as a social value. And it is important to consider leadership knowledge as common heritage in Colombia and in the world. It is very important to have this process of information democratization. And we have information, geographic information that led us to understand multiple challenges. Regarding the legal basis, the national reference framework does not substitute the rules and regulations of the country, but it contributes to the implementation and may support government intermediation or support to the governance state. This legal basis is not only agricultural, but it includes the environmental, social, and services infrastructure basis, and some aspects of other bases that are cross-cutting to this. Principle, criteria, and indicator. Principles are general requirements. Criteria are specific requirements to meet the principles, and indicators are variables that useful to know the condition. All the indicators have, must have, and are built on a participatory manner through some technical regional commissions, some thresholds through which we decide the floor of the indicator. So the ranges for us to see if the behavior is appropriate or not. We have several principles. Each principle may have several criteria, and each criteria may have multiple indicators. These are the principles: resource management, multifunctionality, productivity, well-being, capacity of adaptation, governance. So I'm going to talk about the wish, the desired states based on this principle. It is a desired state when the landscape meet the criteria. What the criteria is that they respond to the any sustainability thematic, that they have plans of management plans, that they have an integral traceability system. We have overcome some deficiencies, and as well as from the generation of a law that led us to move forward faster in terms of traceability. And we also evaluate and document performance and different criteria and indicators, and we manage the granting of public goods, which are vital for the livestock production. Regarding the multifunctionality principle, the landscape must adapt to diversity and territorial specificity. Not all landscapes are produced the same way. We keep heterogeneous mosaics, and we favor functional relations. I want to emphasize something here. The change of land use, change of coverage, and deforestation are included within this criteria. When we talk about territorial specificity, we're analyzing the coverage, not only if the coverage exists or not, but also how diverse it is and what is the level of naturality. This led us to see that the changes on land use through the indicators and variables, the change of land use, their effect, what effect they have on the ecosystem, systems of regulation and production. I cannot give you details, but this is my message. With regard to the carbon and climate, they are within the criteria to promote functional relationships. The criteria is called landscape regulation. We analyze all the ecosystem processes necessary for the maintenance of the biophysical dynamics and geochemical cycles in the landscape. It includes regulations, for example, the natural control or the existence of depredators and beaches. This is Juan Carlos. You only have 3 minutes, Clarita. We're talking about productivity regarding the biomass, less use of natural resources, and efficiency, storage, necessary storage, multidimensional cost, efficiency in technical services and labor, health, comfort and satisfaction, good social relationships, positive financial behavior, appropriate mechanisms of governance. So participation and confidence, collective actions. We need to evaluate the requirements to close the gaps and capacity to link to remain, to stay in the market with a differentiated product. And for transition, we need innovation and we need to confirm the progress. With regard to the pilots, we have the aspects of the socio-ecological context for each landscape. We check the ecological structure, the relationship with the agricultural border, what we call, well, the existence of ecosystems, the dynamics and hydrological structure, everything related to the capacity of regeneration, social economic conflict, and the measurement of indicators of each criteria. There we show the maximum, the thresholds and measures. Here we are seeing how this is expressed, how a specific indicator is expressed on a map from a specific species for each landscape. And then we establish the nonconformities of criteria for each indicator. And finally, we have the analysis table where we see what are the nonconformities and what are the vital aspects we must analyze the management. Thank you so much. This is our email address and the reference literature was already shared. I don't know if we need to share it on the chat box. Excellent. I cannot insist enough in the important role of all these sustainable livestock groups or tables. Then ICA, we as ICA, we participate on the Mexican group. We help the Argentinian group and Canada. There's a roundtable for sustainable beef. It plays such an important role that now it is more than 20% of the bovine cattle in Canada is raised in farms and ranches that are certified according to sustainability standards. And without this table, this Colombian table, you saw the indicators, important work, but in 15 minutes we cannot congratulate you for everything you do. So we invite you to see Clarita's biography, and there are links to several interesting resources for participants to learn more. Maybe in the chat, Clarita, it is important to include some resources.
I'm going to switch over to English. So we're moving from Colombia to Canada, and it's my pleasure to invite the president of Carbon Asset Management, Jason Bradley, to give a Canadian perspective. Over to you, Jason.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for the invitation to participate to my fellow presenters. I also want to give a shout out to friends and neighbors at the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef and the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. Some of the people on the Canadian side I actually went to high school with. So I love the work that they do and appreciate that. It's been great to hear the presentations and follow along and to get to know a bit more about ICA. I want to just preface things quickly, give you a little bit of background about me so you know where I'm coming from, to give you some context. And to let you know, for my presentation, I'm going to bring things to a bit more of a ground level practical approach from the rancher producer perspective and what that means, the beef sector, the carbon markets. I spent my first 10 years in technology design and manufacturing, so a tech background. I spent 19 years on the back of a horse on a large cattle ranch, 5 years in academia and applied research, and now as the president of Carbon Asset Solutions. So just so you know where I'm coming from, to give it context of what I'd like to share with us around carbon markets in the beef sector. Okay, I'm assuming you can see my landing screen.
Yes.
It's all good. Okay. So just to give you perspective of that, the place where I spent those years, that was my neighbor on the back of a horse back at the time that I worked at the Red Deer River Ranch. So that's 20 kilometers by 20 kilometers in terms of size of where we were ranching cattle. Some of the pictures I saw in the other presentations I found interesting. I saw deforestation. There's a good example here of some timber harvesting, but there's a lot of reforestation happening in here as well. So it was an interesting comparison to me to see those. You know, we talked a lot about sustainable agriculture today. I like to look at things in a third way. To me, there's four sort of quadrants to primary production in terms of conventional chemistry-based agriculture production. There's organic, which some decades ago made that switch to try and move away from that chemistry-based model. There's sustainable. We've heard a lot about that today. And I really like to move the conversation more towards regenerative, but to still create common ground and to hold common ground. And so not to create polarization between right or wrong or good versus bad, but this should be much more of a and discussion rather than an or discussion. And so that's how I like to approach everything that I'm currently doing and have done in the past. And so let's just quickly talk about regenerative agriculture, those 6 core principles. There's other versions of this. This is the one that seems to fit the best for me. So as a place to move from sustainable to regenerative ag is that system of farming principles and practices as outlined here. So stepping back and understanding your context. And then looking at the 5 practices of the principles where the practices exist, minimizing soil disturbance, maximizing crop diversity, so using many different kind of crops together rather than just monoculture, keeping the soil covered, maintaining a living root year-round, and integrating livestock. And so that's a lot of what we're talking about today is how do we use, predominantly we're talking about beef, but other livestock species to create a nature-based system to create more synergy in food production. And so the question is, what is the opportunity for carbon credit generation in the beef sector? So the image on the left just reminds us that farming and ranching is a system of systems. And so when you look at this image, we're reminded that there's carbon dioxide that's released from soil from the natural processes. There's also, as we know, industrial carbon dioxide. There's a lot of fossil fuel involved in food production that ends up as atmospheric carbon. But we know through photosynthesis from plants and animals being integrated into the landscape that we can actually sequester more soil carbon by far than what we've been doing in the last many decades. And so that's the opportunity from that system point of view to add more soil carbon and to create additionality and permanence in the soil, to take that atmospheric carbon and put it where we need it. By increasing functional soil health, farmers actually increase their profitability. And they do that because they either maintain or increase their yields, whether it's a meat yield or whether it's a small grains or oilseed yield, but they reduce and sometimes eliminate their inputs, their synthetic inputs. And so the men and women that have found the ways to create more synergy through a regenerative ag system are entirely more profitable. And that often is their first driver, is they're running a business, and that's where they're looking for profitability. Then they're increasing their functional soil health, which then has a significant effect on water infiltration rates and water use efficiency in the soil, and lowering the NO2 emissions, which was one of the gases that was talked about earlier. And so what does this mean in terms of opportunity for agriculture and beef as a part of that? So this image talks about a 1% only share of the market where agriculture produces a carbon credit. If it's true that agriculture can produce 12 to 14% of the CO2, but only 1% of the carbon credits, then just that alone tells us there's a significant opportunity for farmers and ranchers globally to be able to access the carbon market, because that 1% of carbon credit is based on more of a conventional approach to production. And so this just helps us understand the difference between the mandatory market from a carbon credit point of view, sort of that cap and trade system where they, if you look at the left side of the image on the left, it's trying to say, well, there's the total actual emissions. If we reduce those emissions by a certain amount, then what we end up with is a surplus of CO2 still being emitted. But if we get below the cap, then there's going to be emissions reductions that and then can be shared. That's somewhat of a closed system. The voluntary market, on the other hand, identifies there's still the CO2 emissions that need to be reduced, but the carbon credits are created by either emissions reduction. In this graphic, it shows renewable energy. But when you think about agriculture, and where an agriculture can create that measured removal of atmospheric carbon and putting it in the soil, and therefore creating additionality and permanence, and also providing another income stream to farmers, because if they're creating carbon credits through the practices, they're not only improving their profitability on their commodities, but then carbon itself becomes a commodity, and they get access to being able to sell that carbon and create another revenue stream. In fact, some of the leading practitioners of this, one of them that I know, does not have a cash flow statement. He actually has a carbon flow statement in his business, because he wants to track where the carbon is entering and exiting, and then he attributes value to that in his business. So just some personal experience and success that I've had that I want to share with you. So at the Red Deer River ranches where I was, when I really think about it, the last 3 years that I was there, I realized that I wasn't using my cattle and my grazing as a system. I kept trying to break down the industrial production model to get more efficient and to get more pounds weaned and to get more animals, bred versus open. And what struck me was, well, if I use my cattle and my grass together as in a systematic approach, and I put in things like adaptive multi-paddock grazing using electric fence and a gravity-fed water system, and where I put the cattle where I want them. One of the first presenters was talking about the removal of different livestock species, and we had tens of millions of bison across North America. Adaptive multi-paddock grazing, and this recreates that exact same thing, because 100, 200, 300 head of cattle can work the same as a mob of tens of thousands of bison that were being kept together by predators. And so what I was able to realize with my system is, over 3 years, a 300% increase in forage production and utilization without any synthetic fertilizer use at all, no herbicide or other synthetic inputs. But what I was actually doing was driving the improvement in functional soil health, improving my profitability. And we were not at this point accessing the carbon market, but with what I want to continue to discuss with you, this would have allowed us to access the carbon market and create another revenue stream, anywhere from $40 an acre and up, depending on what the current spot market price is. And what I learned, what every practitioner learns when they start doing adaptive multi-paddock grazing, and when I think of sustainable beef or regenerative practices, is there will not be enough cattle. There's never enough cattle, because once you start to work that as a system, you realize that the system responds in a way that you can't necessarily predict. And over time, you'll always realize that you need more cattle. So if I think of that from a national or international perspective, there won't be enough cattle for us to effectively implement regenerative agriculture at scale to be able to realize the opportunity for regenerative agriculture and to support net zero by 2050. The other thing that's an interesting thought is there may not be enough atmospheric CO2 right now at 450 parts per billion to allow regenerative agriculture to work at the level of efficiency it needs to work at. That is probably antithetical to what most of us have heard for the last few decades. But there's more and more science coming out saying that the opportunity that we have ahead of us, even with the current atmospheric CO2, would allow a great increase in carbon sequestration and allow that system to get primed and working the way it should be. So I want to share with you is a very short video. This is an example of regenerative agriculture at work. So I built this little 18-acre paddock using 8 different varieties of plants, including a ryegrass, a vetch, a turnip, a clover, a radish, and field peas and oats. And this little video is showing 86 cow-calf pairs, so 172 animals on 0.14 hectares for a 48-hour graze period is how long they would have been on there. But this is what happens when you use many different kind of plants together, different plant species, different animal species, and you create a regenerative ag system without any of those synthetic inputs. And so that crop would typically be about 36 inches tall in a conventional setting. It was over 60 inches tall by September 11th of this year after planting. It was so tall that I could literally not walk through it. But that's the result of using plants and animals together and recreating some of those nature-based systems that we know that existed. So what's the opportunity for beef production in the carbon market? So some of the problems that we're seeing, so there is a global imbalance carbon cycle. I don't always, personally, I can't always understand what that is, but it seems to be at an imbalance. There's unavailable or inefficient mechanisms to remove, or for carbon removal units, so to remove atmospheric carbon, to put it into the soil, so they can be recorded, verified, and made available as offset or inset credits. There's no existing pathway to connect ag soil carbon sequestration to global capital markets to stimulate the flow of capital. Carbon taxation is inefficient. It's not an incentive to do better. There's a reduction in the nutrient density of food. Extractive primary agriculture practices lead to continuously decreasing functional soil health. Our current chemistry-based industrial production model extracts carbon out of the soil as opposed to a more regenerative approach. There are challenges globally with farm productivity and profitability. Currently, there isn't a farmer-focused soil carbon measurement recording verification platform. That doesn't exist. And a precise and scalable soil carbon measurement technology is not available. So the company I've moved to out of sincere interest and opportunity is doing 3 things. It's providing this measurement recording verification platform. So measurement through a new technology called mobile inelastic neutron scattering, using a neutron generator and gamma ray detectors to measure soil carbon at the atomic level. It's using a recording of that directly from the soil into Microsoft Azure, into blockchain. So it takes away all the friction and inefficiency of conventional dry combustion testing. And our platform is very efficient because we then verify it directly against the very recent ISO standards for GHG emission reductions. Instead of going through other verification bodies, we actually verify directly against the standard. And so just a quick other, this is the unit itself. This is just the measurement part of that. This is the MINS unit, the mobile inelastic neutron scattering. And the video shows how it's small. As you can see, it's got a very small footprint. It uses a pulse low energy neutron beam that stimulates the carbon atoms in the soil, reflecting signatures that are captured by those gamma ray detectors. A continuous scan across the field measures soil carbon in a 3-dimensional space at 30 centimeters depth, 1.5 meters wide. It scans at 30-second intervals across a polygon in the field, providing atomic level carbon measurements that are recorded using geospatial data, so that can come back to the same place year after year. And essentially over an 8 to 16 acre polygon, we measured every carbon atom in 25 tons of soil. So about 2 to 6% of the entire land area. And so and by doing this at a year 0 and a year 2, at 2 years after the baseline measurement, after a farmer or rancher has changed their practices to actually sequester carbon in the soil, starting from their baseline, we measure it at this highly precise level. They then can create a carbon credit that we can forward sell on the market, and they get access to 60% of the forward sale price of that. So we share that back with them. And that to me is where there's incentive versus some of the taxation schemes that we're seeing. So thanks very much for letting me share, and I hope to have drawn together some of the great academic discussion and show from a practical point of view where that opportunity is in beef and carbon.
Fantastic opportunity, Jason. Really enjoying this and your examples from the tech and this incentive or opportunity for producers and ranchers, and the example I thought was very inspirational on that small slot of land, like 14 hectares. Like, I think that those are the kind of things you want to see more and more to inspire change. And we've gone a bit over time, so we don't have much time for debate or discussions. I did want to invite our final presentation from Spain. We have Dr. Sonia Martí from IRTA, giving us a perspective for ruminants. Over to you, Sonia.
Hello everybody. Ay, perdonad, en español, es que hasta ahora. Buenas tardes a todos.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for the invitation, for inviting Maria and myself. Maria is not going to be here, so I'm going to give the presentation. In this case, it's going to be a little bit different compared to what we have seen. I will show you our production system, which differs a lot from the production system in America. And then I will focus our strategies at the research level that we are developing to improve the sustainability of our beef production. Next. To begin with, some characteristics. Our production system does not use hormones, and we do not use steers. We have two arrivals from there's one coming from the calf, and we produce a high number of is coming from the dairy beef. The main ones, which are the result of the dairy farms. Something important is that traditionally we are a country where chicken and pig and pork have a lot of influence. Therefore, we have ended by producing our beef similarly. So normally there are integrations with manufacturing of and they give us the food, and this is the cycle. So an integration. Our diets are really concentrated. We give concentrate, and our fiber source is normally straw, and we did them separately. We give them separately. Our farms are semi-closed with a natural ventilated barn with a density of 3.6 animals per square meter, and most of the soil is with the straw. And when slaughtering animals, we slaughter young animals, 12 to 18 months. We have different cuts. In North America, here we are requested pale meat, not so red, with low IM fat, low level of fat.
Vale, esto es España, ¿vale?
This is Spain.
Nosotros estamos en la zona donde está el círculo, ¿vale?
we are in
Una
the
zona donde se
region of the
dedica
circle.
prácticamente al
This region
engorde,
is a
¿vale?
region dedicated to
Mucha parte de ternera de carne, o sea, lo que son las madres y los terneros están en el centro y norte de España.
we
Y
dedicate
después
our
hay una gran
time
producción también
to
de vaca lechera en el
fattening or
norte
to
y este
growing
de España. Y
animals.
entonces
There
traemos
is
terneros
in the
para
north
la
and
zona
west
de
of
engorde,
Spain, we
que
have
son
dairy
las zonas estas del
animals.
este.
So they bring the calves from this eastern region.
Vale. El
For
origen de los animales, como os he comentado, hay un origen interno que viene de lo que es del norte de
purpose
hacia
coming from the north of Spain to the east of
que
Spain,
está también en el
and
centro.
the pastures or the grasslands, which is in the center of Spain.
Una característica muy importante es
An
que
important practice is that we import many calves less than 2 months old,
en el engorde de este
and
ternero
we are specialized in fattening these calves from dairy farms or dairy barns. There is 6% of imports from France and Ireland and Germany. And one problem is the transportation of these animals, which is really questioned because of the animal well-being. And the imports that come to Spain from living animals as 2-month-old animals to be fattening here. We export cows.
Como, bueno, los países árabes, mayoritariamente.
The Arabic countries mainly, and this is something cattle breeders or farmers have done recently. We do not send meat instead of calves. This is another animal well-being problem because they prefer to make the sacrificing, the slaughtering in their countries. Next.
Siguiente.
Next. Okay, we have two origins. What we call the dairy beef and the cow calves. Those are called pasteros. Our production cycle is, this is the calf, which is the lactating one. It gets to the farms from 15 days old or 28 days old. So we provide a liquid phase, a phase of liquid food. And this is the fattening phase with two parts, the fattening phase and the finishing phase. You have a couple of pictures here to see the farms, how they are, and the feeding system that we have with the straw.
Normalmente aquí lo que tenemos es mayoritariamente animales.
And animal fed. We have the mainly Holstein animals. Now we're changing a little bit to give more value to this calves. So we are inseminating more with meat attitude animals.
Cárnicas.
And we have Angus and or Mongolians that have more and more value in our market. In the case of cow-calf beef systems, they get to the farms with 6 months old. So we apply the fattening part. They arrive with 440 pounds, which are 200, 250 kilograms. And we move to the fattening phase and the finishing phase, as you can see on the pictures. Next.
Vale. Así, características rápidas para tener unos
main characteristics of both systems.
los de origen
We
de
have
los orígenes de carne.
dairy beef origin and cow-calf origin.
Son eso, entre 99, 102,
Initial weight from 99 and 132 pounds, and cow-calf 440 and 550. Final weight a little bit higher in the cow-calf compared to the dairy beef. And fattening days are 6 weeks with liquid feeding phases, 9 growing and fattening weeks. Next. Those are productive numbers where you can see, and this is information regarding the quality of meat quality. A disadvantage is that the dairy beef has a high cost and stuff because we need to provide the liquid replacement. The animal is, and the cow calf is temporal animal, it arrives from August, September, and the cost of the animal is high, very high.
Vale. Los costes de producción en el
production cost distribution in the dairy beef system, 56% of cost is food, animal fed, and in the case of the cow calf, is animal fed, and the cost of the animal are the highest ones.
Lo que hemos comentado, aquí podéis ver la foto.
Feeding system. Here you can see the picture about the way they eat. We have a part with the concentrate. It is the part with the straw. He is eating concentrate and straw as well. Most farms use, for example, pellet instead of other material because of the integration. Spain has a limited number. Has a limited number of crops.
¿Cómo se llama en español ahora? Bueno, no pasa nada. Entonces tenemos que importar.
So we need to import a lot of cereal. Cereals are imported from other countries. We do not have grasslands, and as I have commented, they comes from the integration system, pork and chicken, but the system is efficient. We have low levels of conversion rate. We do not have, even if you're surprised with this feeding system, we do not have acidosis issues. We have a low water footprint, and the fact of bringing these animals coming from dairies in Europe makes that the system is not, that the production is no seasoning production. Some images, we have different systems, mainly the one that prevails is the one that you see to the right, to the left of your screen, which is the flooring, the straw flooring. So when we talk about sustainability, you will see this has a very important impact. Next. And this is the meat that the consumer demands. A clear color meat with low fat level. Next. The main challenges in our production system. First, the demands, European demands on production, biodiversity, bioeconomics. Let's say all this framework is one of the things that brings us a lot of challenges to our production. The reduction of the use of antibiotics, the reduction of losses, the restoration of ecosystems and biodiversity, the organic production, and all this goes against, or there is some conflict at the level of what the producer demands. He found all these European demands that sometimes are difficult to adjust. Next. Another challenge we have, since we have very young calves and that are makes that they are not fully carried in the dairy farms. We use antibiotics. The graphs show that on the day number 1, the graph to the left, there are different levels of lung wounds from 1 to 4 increases, severe increases. When they arrive with some wounds, but this grows exponentially once they get to the fattening farms. And the problem we found is that we are not capable to detect these respiratory issues that makes us to increase the use of antibiotics to reduce the mortality of these animals. Next. Another challenge is that we are not, in general, cow producer country. We are a fattening country. So these animals have to come from somewhere. So what we discover is that these cows, according to the European legislation of living animals transportation, they may be transported after starting on 14 days old. So this is when they have a fragile immune system. So the respiratory problems we found before are probably due to the fact that these animals come from some origins transported to others, and they are experiencing stress. From the European Union, a new legislation is being submitted. And from IRTA at the research level, we are working to try in order to improve the arrival and the transportation manner of these animals. Next, another big problem we have at the productive level from our production system is that we produce male calves. In general, this is because of the legislation, the European legislation that limits the mutilation of animals. So if we have animals, you put animals in hens that are not small but confined, the level of aggression is high enough, and this has a consequence in the quality of the meat with high levels of dark meat. Next. We have been studying the water footprint. Water is divided in 3 types of water: green water, gray water, and blue water. In general, there is a calculation done worldwide that says that to produce 1 kilo of meat, we need 15,000 liters of water. With the Spanish production system, making all the calculation from the calf to the finishing, we use 5,500 liters of water. So our production system based in this kind of food and in this semi-closed farms, we are able to reduce significantly the water footprint. Next. We have worked in the reduction of nitrogen emissions, and we have done it through diets. By reducing the levels of protein from 14% to 12%, we were able to reduce 20% the nitrogen emissions in manure. Now, we will receive, because I'm positive about that, we were going to get a new project called beef methane reduction. We want to replace the use of palm oil by polyunsaturated oil from proximity origin, with the idea to reduce methane emissions. Next. in this slide in a project called Big Compost. We have been working these last years. As I said, our farms is using straw. When this straw is combined with the feces of the animals, it produces manure that may be used, that may be good, has a pretty good quality to be used for field fertilization. So the graph shows how everything looks like, the consequences of having manure accumulated in the farm with the consequences of having a compost. So it's going beyond and making our manure more productive, treating it with water to make compost and to give it the value for cattlemen as well. Here you can see that in general, there is very little nitrogen and methane emissions. So in the pens, when we start seeing this high level of emissions. In the graph to the right in yellow, the axis to the right shows that having the manure in the farm without doing anything with it makes a high methane production in the farm in orange and in blue and gray. The three other colors, you can see that there is a reduction, a quite significant reduction of methane emissions because of the fact of producing the compost. And these peaks that you see here is whenever we turn, so there is a nitrogen and some methane emission, but when it stabilizes, the methane emission is reduced. We can generate an extra product for field fertilization. This is the end of my presentation. I want to show you a little bit of our production system, which is different from what you are used to see in the Americas region, and where we have been working to make our system more sustainable. And thank you very much. Thanks to you, Sonia. Particularly interesting your last part, challenges and bioeconomic solution to inform our reflection here in the Americas regarding sustainable livestock. We do not have time for debate to invite the panelists to discuss more. I really thank you. Amazing information that we have received.
I'm going to switch over to English just to finish because I don't want to forget anybody. So a big thank you to all of our panelists. Tremendous job. Many perspectives to rich perspectives to helps our thinking to improve our sector here in the Americas. And I know it was a tough job for interpretation, so a big shout out to all the interpreters. Good job. My thanks to the logistics team, and my thanks to our supporters, IFAD, the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and the Canadian Roundtable here in Canada. And really, I've enjoyed this so much. This is our last of the 5 webinars in this series. I hope that you've taken away many good lessons and best practices and learnings for in your work, in your industry, in your farm, in your ranch, and as a policymaker in government, in universities, etc. It's been a joy. My thanks to the panelists once again, and stay safe out there. I know that COVID's not over yet, so please be careful. It was a pleasure seeing you all. Take good care, everyone. Bye-bye now.